Hello and welcome to Listen.Up.People, a podcast of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I'm Dr. Eric Rice, Professor and Associate Dean for Research. Homelessness is a serious issue affecting society, and it's also become a public health epidemic nationwide. For many people, the problem appears unsolvable and that the best that we can hope for is to mitigate it. But my guests today unapologetically believe that it is within our reach to end homelessness. Their dedicated research and community partnership initiatives are proving a pathway forward for achieving that reality. Creating solutions to homelessness is also a focus of my own research, so I'm excited to delve into this issue with my two colleagues. Today I have Dr. Ben Henwood, who leads the Center for Homelessness, Housing, and Health Equity Research, also known as H3E, and he is the director also of the USC Homelessness Policy Research Institute, also known as HPRI. And our second guest is Dr. Seth Pickens, who is the managing director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, before I get diving right into some meaty questions, I want to ask you something a little more personal to start, which is, was there a moment in your life or in your career that was the moment where you said, "Oh, this is the problem I want to work on. Homelessness is where it's at for me"? Because I know you've devoted your careers to this at this point.
Yeah, sure. I don't have that one moment that you're describing. I mean, I think to me it was really a journey, where I was trying to find, what is it that I'm passionate about. Homelessness is not really the thing that sort of came to mind. I think early on in my career as a social worker, I learned about this housing first approach to homelessness. And what intrigued me about it was at the time this like novel concept. It was counterintuitive. It was really flipping the script really of how we thought about homelessness services. And the research was just coming out at the time. This was in 2001 when I was in my
Sure.
master's program. And it was intriguing to me. And so, I wanted to learn more about it. I did my MSW placement in a first program that was doing the work. And I think just really seeing how transformational it could be to get people off the streets and into a safe environment. I think that was really the beginning for me of how it started.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that seeing those transformed lives is a powerful experience. I mean, for before I jump to Seth's answer, just could you explain a little bit maybe what is this housing first thing that you're talking about? You're talking about being flipping the script and it's counterintuitive, but maybe our listeners are thinking, well, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, of course, of course. So, I think for most people today, when we think about homelessness, you think about people living on the streets as if that is something that just is part and parcel to modern day life. But the truth is, it hasn't always been like this. This is a relatively historically recent phenomenon. And I can remember actually in fifth grade, having a classmate who was collecting blankets at the time. This was in Philadelphia, and Trevor, who was in our classmates, started what the Trevor Project, not the one affiliated with suicide prevention that people know today, but this was in the 80s. And it was the reason he started that was because that was the first time we were seeing people actually living on the streets. I mean,
Mhm.
before that, yes, there was homelessness, housing instability, but not this sort of, mass amount of people on our streets.
Yeah.
And there's a historical reason for that we can get into that has a lot to do with sort of this dismantling of the safety nets in our
Mhm.
country during the Reagan era. There was a economic recession. There were demographic shifts, but all of this came together to really cause homelessness as we know it today. And, society wasn't really set up to deal with this problem. And so we were very reactive, and we were reactive by, what do we do? What do we do with these people living on the streets? And so shelters were really the main way in which we try to address the problem,
Right.
and getting people off the streets. And it's interesting because there was some really good research that was done by a colleague of ours, Dennis Colhane at the University of Pennsylvania, who noticed, this was in the 80s, that a lot of people would go to shelters that because of temporary disruptions in their life, and then they, after a short time, less than 30 days, they'd leave and they'd never come back, right? Uh,
Right.
and yet, but he noticed there was another group of people that if they were there longer than 30 days, they often stayed there for a really long time, or maybe they'd exit, but they'd come back. And this was a group that we thought of as sort of the more chronically homeless. And they tended to have, increased rates of like mental illness and other disabilities. And so as we struggle to like, what do we do with these folks that are, living in shelters, ending up back on the streets? They'd get picked up in hospitals,
Sure.
incarcerated, right? We didn't really know what to do. And we were really trying to push people into, they need treatment for whether it's mental illness or addiction. And that just wasn't working.
Yeah.
It's what, was coined by Kim Hopper at the time as this institutional circuit. And Housing First really came along in reaction to that, right? And
Mm.
Sam Simbaris, who actually works here at our school at our center right now, he sort of created this model, which we now know as Housing First, but at the time it was a very, fringe idea, this idea that you would target these individuals who had lots of issues and help them move into apartments, hand them keys to an apartment. That was a very radical idea at the time. But the rationale was this is what people are asking for, this is what they want, and they're probably going to be in a much better place to address all the problems they have if they actually have a stable, safe, secure place to live. Fortunately, Sam had the wherewithal when he was, getting this his program together, Pathways to Housing, to actually study the model. He even conducted a randomized controlled trial where people were randomly either selected to get housing first or to get that kind of usual care, which in hindsight we call treatment first. But there was never a treatment first model or design. That was sort of the
Sure.
default approach. And that research pretty much showed that when you get people into an apartment and you support them, that housing stability goes a long way. And so we were seeing, upwards of 80% of people were successful in a housing first model, whereas the people, in the treatment first approach stayed on the streets in and out of institutions for years. Uh,
Wow.
and so that's really what we talk about housing first. And I have to say it's a remarkable example of where we had, this evidence-based practice research that actually
Mhm.
influenced policy decisions because that initial research that came out, I think the 2004 publication on Housing First that showed those results. Um, at 2010, Housing First became national policy in terms of how you address homelessness. So that is a very short lifespan for research results to get adopted as federal policy, which we
Sure. I
typically
mean,
don't see.
there's this joke about, it usually takes, well, not a joke. I mean, it's a sad reality that we bemoan in research, which is that it often takes 17 years to go from the bench to the bedside, as we like to say within health research. So to go from, 6 years from this publication to federal policy is incredibly fast in the slow moving time frame. And for those of you in the audience who may think, wow, Ben knows a lot about this. Ben literally wrote the book on Housing First. There's a book that Samson Barris, Ben Henwood, and Deb Paget wrote that is called Housing First: Ending Homelessness, Transforming Systems, and Changing Lives. So if you are thinking, wow, this guy seems to know a lot about this, he is one of, if not the world's expert in this approach. And before we dive deeper into that, because I know this is a rabbit hole that we could spend the entire time in, I want to give Seth you a chance to chime in and talk about what was the experience that brought you into doing this work on housing and homelessness.
Yeah, I think it's like Ben said, I don't know if a thunderbolt went off that said homelessness, but there was that kind of epiphany moment. And for me, my background is that I'm actually a pastor by training, and I've been a senior pastor in South LA since 2009. So I got into it from that angle, and homelessness was just one of the civic issues that we were seeing 10, 15 years ago. And, they're, running a food pantry, people, I even let someone sleep in my office, like kind of pulling together money for hotel nights for people in a pinch for all sorts of different reasons. So that was really my baptism into it. And that was just one aspect of kind of the larger work. I think maybe that's part of the conversation. One of the things when we're talking about homelessness, we talk about silos, right? So there's like the
Sure,
clinical
sure.
side, there's the real estate side, there's the researchers, there's the funders, right? And the faith community is kind of its own silo, and so it's operating and kind of doing well and intentioned, but there's a lot of very robust conversation that can, in that silo breaking, bring insight. And maybe we'll talk more about some of those specifics. But as far as my own journey, yeah, I got an opportunity with the Economic Roundtable to direct a project working with community college students, Long Beach City College, at a high risk of
Okay.
persistent homelessness, and directed that project for 3 years and learned a lot about bringing research into play, as well as like we're running the program and evaluating it. Community college students at a high risk of persistent homelessness, if they get housing first solutions, and I didn't even know the term at the time, but essentially housing support with other, clinical and social service resources and expungement and all that, then they'll be less likely to be homeless. Also, with employment pathways, so they can earn more
Sure.
income and be less likely to be homeless. So, yeah, homeless community college students, young adults, here's what we do. Let's get them jobs. Now they're in the trade union. Now they're in healthcare. Now they're making money and they're not homeless anymore. Like that sounds like, something to
Doesn't sound
research.
like rocket science, but it's remarkably difficult to do, I
That's
imagine.
the point. Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like something a researcher would come up with. And like everyone's like, it's brilliant, right? But then, so the reality, of course, is that somewhere between there's so much psychosocio-emotional stuff, just to put
Right.
it briefly, that it's like, I'm homeless today. Now I have a good job. Now I'm not homeless. There's something in there. So that report last year was called The Work Behind Work. And
Oh, I like
that
that.
has unfolded into this conversation around flourishing, and our Flourishing Summit, September 11th. Maybe we'll talk more about that. But the idea that if that's the difficulty, then let's just look at that. And we're like, what was the most valuable part of this experience for them? And there were two things that were both like 86%. One was the money to have housing security and not be homeless. And the other was literally the moral support,
Hmm.
the learning about mindfulness, the networking that they didn't have before, like all of these things that are sometimes considered softer. So we're like, how about if we literally just do that? So now with some of the work with Homelessness Policy Research Institute, and when opportunity comes to work with the guy who wrote the book on housing first, I mean, come on. So here I am. So one of the things we're doing is working with the Department of Health Services, which is rolling into this new
Hmm.
county department this year, next year, looking at best practices. So we look at it, okay, permanent supportive housing. Guess what? Some things are going well. Lack of collaboration, lack of accountability, lack of shared vision is why it's not just working. So what if we literally look at that, solve for collaboration? These are skills that can be taught. Accountability, trust is low,
Yeah.
no shared vision. And so it's actually the same model that, the homeless community college students need, and the, county managers and leaders and case managers and everyone, how you're actually doing, feeling, how you're working together, is pretty important. And
Yeah.
so sometimes the term flourishing gets like short shrift, but that's kind of the journey. And you can see how, the faith journey kind of ties in with some of that too.
Yeah, of course, of course. It makes me think, with this housing first and the way it enables people to flourish, you would think that, and the fact that there's this body of evidence that's been around for almost 20 years that that impacted policy, you'd think that everyone would be on board with housing first, but I certainly know from my own following of the media and also my own interactions with folks in the homelessness service sector community that there's actually been a backlash against housing first. I mean, Ben, maybe Seth, I mean, either one of you want to address sort of what you've seen with respect to this turning the tide seems to be, at least for a moment, the moment there's a lot of skepticism about housing first.
I mean, there definitely is misinformation about what is and isn't housing first, so we can talk about that. But I think at the end of the day, really people are frustrated, right, that this problem persists,
Yeah,
despite large what are perceived as large investments. Especially in Los Angeles, voters have voted to approve additional funding for this problem. And yet we know, in fact, we're involved in producing the estimates each year. We know over the past decade, the homeless population has doubled in Los Angeles. I think the refrain is if housing first was working, why is the homeless population growing? Right.
right.
And so people are looking for someone to blame, and I think housing first has become a sort of a victim of its own success, so to speak, in
Hmm.
that it's an easy target, right? It's an easy
Yeah,
target to say that must not be working, otherwise this problem would have been solved. And the truth is that we've never really scaled housing first approach to the size of the problem, right? And
right.
and the few instances where we've gotten close, we've seen dramatic reductions in homelessness. So I'm just gonna, sort of invoke the VA as a prime example.
Sure, sure.
I don't know if our listeners know, but back in 2014, let's say, when the VA adopted Housing First as its main approach, and Congress went ahead and approved, appropriations funding to really support and scale that program, we saw veterans homelessness in less than a decade, reduced by 50%. And and
Right.
and that's an example of, like, this is a problem that can respond very well to resources when you have these effective solutions in place. And we saw that with the veterans, in part because there's bipartisan support. People believe that veterans shouldn't be on the streets, and so we were willing to allocate resources.
Yeah.
The- There's never really, who's the VA for the rest of for everyone else who's homeless, right? There's never been a funding source that can really, scale the solutions we know work to the size of the problem. So anyway, so that I mean, I think that makes housing first an easy scapegoat.
Sure.
When, really, the research and all the work that's been done, we know that lack of affordable housing is the main driver. Along with that are sort of all the other inequities that come along with who gets access to housing, who doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the main driver, and I think more recently, we've had a 180 on, as much as I talked about housing first becoming federal policy in 2010. As of this year, it is by decree, executive order. People are not supposed to be doing housing first anymore. And that's unfortunate because that, unlike the initial adoption of housing first, that was driven by empirical results. This is really driven by ideology at this point.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think the other thing that has struck me often as very ideological is the blaming of housing programs that are for people experiencing homelessness as being somehow responsible for why people are homeless. And I've sometimes thought about it in the as an analogy to emergency rooms, right? Like that when this would be like saying, well, there's too many people in, the reason that there's so many people in the emergency room is because there's not enough emergency room doctors. It's like, no, people go to the emergency room because they get in car accidents or they have their appendix is about to burst or they've had some other situation happen that drives them to the emergency room. And yeah, there's some triaging and life-saving stuff that happens in an emergency room, but the flow of people into that emergency room has nothing to do with the emergency room. And so, housing first is an emergency response to a problem where someone has already become homeless. It's not a solution for preventing people from ever becoming homeless in the first place. And as you talked about, these problems of lack of affordable housing, especially in the major urban centers of the United States over the last while. I mean, there's another great book that's out there recently called homelessness is a housing problem, by a colleague of ours in Washington. And it's, another one of these, as Seth, you'd say, like the sort of thing that only a researcher would say, right? Like housing is a
Yeah.
homelessness is a housing problem. Like no
Yeah.
kidding. But sometimes the dialogue seems to get very caught up in ideology as opposed to caught up in what we're actually observing. And that this reminds me of another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Ben, and also Seth, which is that USC and the School of Social Work has been really involved in tracking and monitoring the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles since about 2017. And I know that you just had the 2025 homeless count results came out very recently, and there was once again a reduction in homelessness. Can you speak to I guess both the experience of working on those counts and also sort of what you are observing, over time? I know you mentioned that there's been this nearly doubling of the homeless population in the last 10 years, but it's not all bad news, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, look, I think there's been a lot of discussion lately because for the second year in a row now, our annual point in time estimates, which is basically, once a year, the county is required to, produce estimates of how many people they think are experiencing homelessness, that they need to submit that information to HUD. As part of receiving federal funding for homeless services. And since, as you mentioned, since 2017, we've partnered with the county to produce those estimates and help collect the data. A lot of listeners may have participated in the point in time count, which is actually just a volunteer effort to go out literally once a year, canvass their neighborhoods and count how many people they see living on the streets. Um,
Mhm.
we use the data that the volunteers collect, and we pair that with survey data that our teams go out, and we talk to about 4 to 5 thousand unhoused individuals each year, and we use that really to to as the sample to extrapolate and understand the population who's out there and the size of that population. And so, yeah, so the past couple years, we've finally seen sort of a bending of this curve where we peaked out at just over 70,000 homeless individuals in LACOC. So that
Right.
continuum of care, that's what we do. There are four continuums of care in the county, but three are pretty small, and we do the majority of the county. But those numbers have gone down, and so people are hopeful that the investments that have been made have been in getting people off the streets and out of homelessness.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge lift to think that we're going to solve this problem that's at the scale of 70,000 people a night in just a few months or even a couple of years. I mean, at least from my perspective, this investment in taxpayer dollars that LA County and City have done, it's an amazing thing, and it's exactly what we need to have done. And I think that folks sometimes are a bit impatient for results, and we're trying to move an iceberg of a problem, not an ice cube, right? I mean, it's a huge thing. And another thing I know that people are really upset about is really the amount of people who they see visibly out on the streets, unsheltered, in encampments and tents, on the sidewalks. And is LA unique in this experience, or are we worse off than most? I mean, can you maybe talk to our listeners about just sort of like what this unsheltered homeless experience of LA is like?
Yeah, well, LA has the dubious distinction of being, having the largest unsheltered population in the country. But we're not that unusual for any place where there is, housing affordability is high. You see higher rates of homelessness. And so pretty much across the West Coast, you're going to see a lot of unshelteredness. And also there hasn't really been an investment in a shelter system like we have in New York. So New York, actually has overall more people experiencing homelessness than in LA, but most of those people reside in the shelter system, which is quite expensive to maintain, but there are less people on the streets. Uh,
Sure.
Here
Sure.
it's the opposite. We see a lot more people. Almost 3 out of 4 people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles are going to be unsheltered.
Wow. So, Seth, I know you've done a lot of work in the areas of prevention and driving these systemic changes. So, why is this multi-level collaboration structure at HPRI between researchers and services that you're so a part of? Like, why is that so important? And what are we trying to improve about these systems when we're developing policies? I mean, how is this? What's going on for you?
Yeah, just to put it, I guess, purely, the collaboration is about getting to better questions. Einstein says if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes making sure I had the question right. Because when you really, and of course with research, of course, but getting to better questions. So yeah,
Sure.
when we are collaborating, when we're convening, when we're networking, when we're proliferating research, and that's in addition to, the actual research that the Institute facilitates, but that collaborative impact model, which is a model that some organizations use. Anytime, I mean, this conversation, if there were just one of us, it wouldn't be the same, right? So you got to kind of
Mhm.
put it together. And that is something that is maybe underestimated. But when we do that, we come to a lot of fascinating things. Like even in this conversation, there is an element that hasn't come up yet, but it has come up in collaborative discussion. And that is just the nature of real estate. I mean, we realize real
Ah,
estate is the biggest, it's like the engine of capitalism, or certainly, maybe it's the transmission or something, but it's pretty important, right? And it's there with a profit motive. It's kind of baked in. LA County has a finite area.
yeah.
So X number of people unhoused, the timeline to build and the cost to build. So now there are trends like higher density, which, then now we're changing the, scope of the city. So there are a lot of things that come up, like in response to we were talking about some of the federal attacks on
Yeah.
housing first. I think it's fair to say that wherever you lie politically, there's a bit of a danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater,
Yep.
to just kind of wholesale make some of these, sweeping cuts and changes and stuff. And so who's teasing out the baby from the bathwater? Because there is a lot, like I said, there's a lot going right. And there's a lot of people, making these efforts. So this is again what kind of took us in the collaborative, and I don't, but what took us was to this idea of flourishing. So many people are understanding the importance of well-being. And like I said, sometimes it's kind of considered lightweight and stuff,
Sure,
but
sure.
really I mean, the work we've done, and we're working with community-based organizations that administer public, permanent supportive housing, and they're hungry for this conversation.
Yep.
And then even maybe on the other side of the aisle, but whether it's liberal or conservative, the idea of employment, the idea of safety, the idea of dignity, and the idea of these teams who are working. I mean, there's armies in LA alone, thousands of people, of clinicians, how many clinicians, case managers, researchers, just unsung heroes, frontline people, mental health, county, are all working on this issue. So you take those thousands of people, whatever kind of like the zeitgeist, mental health, happiness, trust, teamwork, mindfulness is among us working on this
Oh,
issue
sure, sure.
is the result. So, and it is expensive to build housing. So this idea of flourishing is like, maybe it's more efficient and effective to build up people even
Hmm.
as we're building up the housing. And so HPRI, like you said, there's a lot going on, not even that we're responsible for all of it, but a thought hub, a clearinghouse, a collaborative partner, a networking linchpin has been something that was thought up.
That's no. This makes me think of for a second that HPRI. When we haven't really talked about what is this. And I think I'd love to if you could maybe give I don't know, Ben or Seth or both of you kind of give a little bit of a description of what this institute is and what its mission is. I think it's a really important thing for our listeners to understand.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I was gonna chime in because I was wondering if people were following along. There's a homelessness policy research institute at USC. There's our, research center on homelessness, housing, and health equity research. And so if I can just provide a little bit of
Yeah,
context,
please.
both of these entities came about around the same time, but they have very different sort of origins and sort of purposes. And so, I'll just start, Eric, with the research center that started here at our school in 2018, 2019.
Right.
That really grew out of, and as you know, the work that we were doing here at our school when I came to USC in 2012. I was working with you and Suzanne Wenzel, and Harmony Rhodes, really top scholars in the field, looking at this transition that people had from off the streets into permanent supportive housing, using housing first. And in fact, the National Institute of Health, funded what we called the transition study, where we actually
Right,
followed
right.
people over the course of the year and to see, what changes, we observed in terms of their kind of their health, their behaviors. And so that really was an opportunity for us to work together. Since then, there's been a lot of work that we've done, both in the uh, doing research on supportive housing. So that includes some of the projects related to, this is an aging population. How do we
Mhm.
support adults who are coming off the streets into housing? They have accelerated aging. How do we help them live independently now that we've put all this effort into getting them a home, right? So there's that. We have a study funded by the National Science Foundation to look at, can technology better support people in supportive housing. So we have multiple.
Yeah, and you also we also worked on that one project that was one of your first really big grants that was on how are youth, like young adults who are in these permanent support housing, like how are they doing? I mean, you've really, I mean, for the audience that doesn't know, I mean, not only did Ben literally, not figuratively write this book, but I mean, he's really been working on lots of different angles, youth, aging adults, sort of the more, I guess, typical sort of folks that are sort of our age, middle-aged folks who are in housing. But I mean, you've been doing a lot of different stuff with a lot of different populations, and really with a big emphasis on as Seth was saying, this flourishing and well-being and health. It's not just a focus on, hey, housing is good unto itself, but housing makes people's lives better.
Yeah, again, and I appreciate that, and that was really enabled by, your expertise with the young adult population experiencing homelessness, so we could do that work. But all that is to say, in when we started the research center, it was really an acknowledgement that we're doing a lot of work here. We'd like to house it, together, given this focus, not just on the housing side, but like as you said, I didn't even really think of myself as a homelessness researcher when I got here because, quite frankly, I thought that was the easy part, addressing the homelessness, and it was really like you're saying, how do we help people, flourish once they move into housing? And so it was really, I was a health services researcher, but as we mentioned, there is work to be done to understand just homelessness, and that's why we got involved in the homeless count. We have other projects just related to like street medicine and understanding how do you bring care to the streets. So that's all research that's sort of housed in our research center here at the school. It's more, I don't want to say traditional research, but it's funded by the traditional institutes like the National
Sure.
Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. HPRI has a very different origin story in the sense that it was developed initially at the Price School of Public Policy. Just last year, it became a joint institute now at public policy and the School of Social Work. It
Hmm.
is a collective impact model where the goal is not necessarily to produce that research that I was just talking about, but it's to support researchers to do that work and to have a collective impact to like what is the body of research that's happening here in Southern California and how do we translate that into effective policy. And so
Yeah.
there was this recognition that we need to convene researchers together along with policymakers, along with the people working in the field, along with people with lived experience. And that was why HPRI was developed to sort of have that convening function. They're much different goals and purposes, but they are very complementary to one another.
Yeah, and as you're describing the center, it makes me think of something that Seth, you said at the beginning of our conversation, which was that you're really interested in breaking down these silos, right? And so, with your role in the HPRI, what do you do to convene and break down convene these groups of people, break down these silos, make an impact? I mean, how are you what's your day-to-day, way of tackling these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's the reactive side of it, and then there's a proactive side of it.
Okay.
That might be one way to frame it. So reactive is literally just within USC, there's street medicine at Keck, there's the dentistry school has stuff going on. There's other research institutes publishing things and wanting to make connections, and that's just within USC. Then similarly across research and policy. So, the emails are coming in. We're seeing, events that are happening where, making connections. We're being invited to speak and share. So that's like just the reactive side. The
Hmm.
proactive side has taken a few forms. The main one is periodic convenings or regular convenings. There's, research committee, there's a data gaps committee, there's a race equity committee. Each of them kind of have their own sub direction or agenda or network within the network of questions, conversations that they are solving. This idea of flourishing, we are convening a summit September 11th at USC, where we will be having these cross silo conversations, civic leaders, policy, AI, medicine, health, even, like well-being best practices. So there's space to innovate.
Yeah.
There's a lot of evidence that improv will help people work better together if they spend an hour kind of playing a game and kind of learning how to do that. And so there's a lot of science and research to back that up. So we're inviting folks to do that and try it at the summit. So these are frontline workers. These are county managers, leaders, property managers across permanent supportive housing, asset managers, people with lived experience, privileging their voices in these
Nice.
kind of ivory tower and city hall conversations.
And that's a really important thing. I mean, I think, this is something that at least I struggle with in my own work is the the reality that I am not somebody who's experienced homelessness. I care very much about this problem, but giving people who haven't had this experience a voice in these spaces is such an important thing. And it's great to hear that you're doing that. I mean, do you have mechanisms that you like? Do you have a formal board of those folks, or how do you do that?
Yeah, people call them, in other organizations, community advisory boards. But on several of our committees, we really do endeavor to have that voice. It's not just like one community advisory board, but
Yeah.
all the way through. Because, yeah, what good is it? If I've, never really been homeless, there was a moment there senior year of undergrad that, we don't talk about that, but I was never really homeless, to really be
Yeah.
serious and sincere.
I have one last question that I want to throw to each of you. What is, from your perspective, one of the biggest misconceptions about homelessness or people living with homelessness that you would like to dispel?
To put it briefly, it's probably an assumed dichotomy, like there's an us and a them. There's
Mm.
like, thank God I work in this office, and thank God I have a washing machine, and thank God I'm not homeless. And then them with their, addiction and bad roll of the dice and mental illness and like, but literally, this is what one of the things that comes out is like a parallel process where if a case manager is there to facilitate change in a person's life, accountability would hold that they must be endeavoring in some sort of change of life, some sort of improvement, so that there's some sort of us and them that's really
Yeah.
baked deeply in the conversation because of financial realities. But that's something that we could take a closer look at.
Yeah, no, that's really thoughtful. And Ben, what about you? What's a misconception around the experience of homelessness or people experiencing homelessness that you would like to see
Yep.
leave the dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Seth, and I'll just sort of go back to the data and what we know. And it is true that there's a misperception, and in fact, the Trump administration's executive order made the claim that the majority of people on the streets are criminals, are have mental illness, are addicted to drugs. I don't know anywhere where that data supports that claim. And if you just look at the information we have, yes, while there are higher rates of, say, addiction and mental illness in the homeless population, it is not the majority of people out there. There are a lot of different misperceptions. People like claim that the reason we have such high rates of homelessness here is because people come, for the weather. They like Southern California and they move here to be homeless. And people are not upwardly mobile and decide, hey, where's the best place to be homeless? That's not what happens. People end up homeless where they grew up, where they live, and where
Hmm.
they've experienced misfortune. Look, I get it. I think one way to think about that question, because it's like, well, you're saying that, but what about what I see on the streets, right? And
Sure.
I think it's worth pointing out, and some people have described it as like a game of musical chairs, right? And in this case, we're going to talk about housing. If there's not enough housing, like literally just not enough, it means someone is going to be without a home. And then
Hmm.
the question is, who is more likely to be that person, right? And that's why
Hmm.
you tend to see people who have additional challenges are the ones who end up homelessness. But that doesn't explain why they're homeless, right? The
Right.
reason they're homeless is there is just not enough of a very basic need. And until we change that equation, we're always going to have this situation and see that. I will just add one other point that I do think we need to start having a real conversation around homelessness because there's sort of the camp and look for I'm among this camp that feels like we can solve this problem, we can end homelessness, right? And then you have the people that are like, no, it's because of people's failings. That's why they're homeless. There's nothing we can really do about it. I mean, neither one is right. I mean, I think both extremes have their points, but if we're not going to invest right in sort of the basic needs that our society has and have enough affordable housing, we will have this problem, right? There's no getting around that. And then the question becomes, how do we manage it, right? And like,
Hmm.
how do people get like access to water and bathrooms and trash pickup? I mean, nobody wants to go there and talk about it, but if we're going to have encampments because we don't have any place for people to go, then what are the policies to manage that? And that is not, I mean, I get it. That's not a conversation that wins politicians any votes, but it's
Sure.
one that we need to have because this problem is going to persist if we don't sort of change the way we're going or decide we're going to have this real conversation and figure out better ways to deal with it and manage it.
Well, Ben, Seth, thank you both so much. That was a great way to take us out. And we really just scratched the surface in terms of all of the vast amount of work that you all have done. Problems as big as homelessness don't get solved overnight. If they were something that we could have solved overnight, we would have done it. And as you said there at the end, Ben, there's some real challenging dialogues and societal investments that need to be made. In the meantime, you want to learn more about Ben and Seth's work, please check out their websites. So there are two. One is h3e.usc.edu. That's for the housing, homelessness, and health. And then there is the hpri.usc.edu, and that's for the Housing Policy Research Institute. And if you have any questions for our guests or want to support the sort of transformative research that goes on here at the School of Social Work, you can email us at Listen.Up.People@usc.edu. And I just want to thank you both so much again for your time and, more importantly, for the passion and dedication that you bring to this work and making people's lives better.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. It's been great.